The cold wind whistled through the cracks in the wooden door as Amara pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. She was 15 years old, but some days she felt like she had lived 100 years. Life had not been kind to her, not since the fever took her parents 2 winters ago. Her small cottage sat at the edge of the village, almost forgotten by everyone. The stone walls were crumbling in places and the roof leaked when it rained. But it was home. It was all she had left of her mother and father. Every corner held a memory. The kitchen where her mother used to make bread. The chair by the fire where her father would tell stories. Now those spaces felt empty and cold. Amara woke up before sunrise every morning. There was no choice in the matter. If she wanted to eat, she had to work. Her small garden behind the cottage grew vegetables, though not many. The soil was rocky and poor. She had 6 chickens that gave her eggs. On good days, she could sell a few eggs at the village market. On bad days, she ate nothing but thin soup made from whatever she could find. The villagers treated her with a strange mixture of pity and distance. Some of the older women would give her leftover bread when they saw her. A few farmers let her collect water from their wells. But nobody really wanted to get too close to an orphan girl. Bad luck, they whispered. Better to keep away. So Amara learned to survive on her own, asking for help only when she was desperate. The village itself was caught in a dangerous place. It sat right between 2 powerful forces that hated each other. To the north was the Northern Kingdom, with its armored soldiers and stone fortresses. To the south were the southern clans, fierce warriors who lived in the mountains and rode horses like they were born on them. For years, these 2 powers had been fighting over land, over resources, over old grudges that nobody could even remember anymore. The fighting had gotten worse recently. Every few weeks there would be news of another battle, another raid, another village burned. The Northern Kingdom controlled Amara's village, and their soldiers patrolled the streets with hard eyes and harder hearts. They didn't care much about protecting the people. They only cared about keeping control and watching for enemies. Everyone in the village tried to stay invisible. Don't take sides. Don't ask questions. Don't get involved. Keep your head down and maybe, just maybe, you'll survive another day. This was the wisdom that parents taught their children. This was how people lived in the borderlands. Amara understood this better than most. Being invisible was something she had practiced for 2 years. She moved through the village like a ghost, doing her work, speaking only when spoken to, never drawing attention. The northern soldiers barely noticed her. To them, she was just another poor village girl, not worth their time. Her only real companion was Gray, an old shepherd dog that had belonged to her father. Gray was getting old now. His muzzle was white and his back legs were stiff, but he stayed by Amara's side faithfully. On the coldest nights, he would sleep by her feet, sharing his warmth. When she cried alone in the darkness, missing her parents, Gray would rest his head on her lap as if he understood. The autumn was particularly harsh that year. The leaves fell early from the trees and frost came before anyone expected it. Food became scarcer. The soldiers took more than their share from the village stores, leaving less for everyone else. Amara's chickens stopped laying as many eggs. Her garden was nearly finished for the season. Winter was coming, and she didn't know how she would survive it. But Amara had learned something important in her short, difficult life. She had learned that tomorrow always comes whether you're ready for it or not. She had learned that you keep going even when everything seems hopeless. And she had learned that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can mean everything to someone who has nothing. She didn't know it yet, but that last lesson was about to change her entire life. In just a few days, she would face a choice that would test everything she believed about mercy, about courage, and about what it means to do the right thing even when the whole world tells you it's wrong. For now, though she was just a girl trying to survive, just an orphan that the village had forgotten, just another invisible person in a world that had become hard and cruel. But invisible people sometimes see things that others miss. And forgotten people sometimes do things that everyone remembers forever. The morning started like any other. Amara woke up cold and hungry, wrapped in her threadbare blanket. Gray was already awake, sitting by the door with his ears perked up. Something had caught his attention, but Amara was too tired to care. She had work to do. She grabbed her wooden bucket and headed toward the stream that ran along the forest edge. The water there was clearer than the village well, and it was free. The walk took about 15 minutes past empty fields and through a small grove of trees. Most villagers didn't come this way anymore. Too close to the old barn, they said. too close to trouble. The old barn had been abandoned for years. It used to belong to a farmer who died before Amara was born. Now it was just a rotting structure that everyone avoided. Soldiers sometimes used it for storage or as a temporary shelter during patrols, but mostly it just sat there falling apart piece by piece. As Amara walked past it that morning, she heard something strange. A sound that made her stop in her tracks. It was low and painful, something between a moan and a groan. For a moment she thought it might be an injured animal. Her first instinct was to keep walking. Getting involved in anything unusual was dangerous these days, but the sound came again, and this time she could tell it was human. Someone was in that barn and they were hurt. Amara stood frozen, her heart pounding. Every sensible thought in her head screamed at her to walk away. Mind your own business. Don't get involved. Stay invisible. Yet her feet carried her toward the barn anyway. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was just that she knew what it felt like to suffer alone, and she couldn't ignore someone else's pain. The barn door hung loose on its hinges. She pushed it open slowly, and the morning light spilled into the darkness inside. What she saw made her gasp and take a step backward. There in the corner was a man bound with thick ropes. His hands were tied behind his back and his feet were bound together. He was slumped against the wall, barely conscious, but it wasn't just any man. He was wearing armor, pieces of it anyway, and on his chest plate, even covered in dirt and blood, she could see the mark clearly. The wolf head symbol of the southern clans. This was an enemy warrior. This was exactly the kind of person the northern soldiers told villagers to fear and hate. Amara's first thought was to run. If anyone saw her here with him, she would be accused of treason. They would think she was helping the enemy. The punishment for that was death. No trial. No questions asked. The northern soldiers didn't show mercy to traitors, but she couldn't stop staring at him. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't some terrifying demon. He was just a man, and he was dying. His face was pale and covered in sweat despite the cold morning air. There was a deep wound across his shoulder, crusted with dried blood. His lips were cracked and bleeding. When had he last had water? How long had he been here? The man's eyes flickered open and focused on her with difficulty. For a moment, they just looked at each other. She saw confusion in his eyes, then resignation. He probably thought she was there to mock him or hurt him more. Why else would a village girl come to see a captured enemy? Amara swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking. Every logical part of her brain was screaming warnings. Walk away, forget you saw this. Tell no one. Save yourself. The world was cruel, and people who tried to help others often ended up destroyed themselves. She had learned that lesson when her parents died and the village barely lifted a finger to help her. But another voice spoke in her heart. A quieter voice, but somehow stronger. It was the voice of her mother, who used to say that we're all just people trying to survive in this broken world. It was the voice of her father, who once helped a stranger fix his wagon even though they had no food for themselves that week. It was the voice of something inside herself that she thought had died along with her parents. The warrior tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. He was asking for water. Amara looked around nervously, making sure no one was watching. Then she made a decision that would change everything. She ran to the stream, filled her bucket as quickly as she could, and returned to the barn. Kneeling beside him, she lifted the bucket to his lips. He drank desperately, water spilling down his chin. She could see the relief in his eyes, the gratitude. When he finished drinking, he looked at her with confusion. Why was she helping him? Amara didn't have a good answer. She didn't understand it herself. All she knew was that leaving him here to die slowly felt wrong. More wrong than breaking the rules. More wrong than the risk she was taking. She examined his shoulder wound. It was infected and needed cleaning. She would need herbs and clean cloth. As she stood to leave, the warrior spoke one word in a rough, weak voice. His accent was thick, but she understood. Thank you. Those two syllables carried more weight than any gold. She nodded and quickly left the barn, her mind racing with what she had just committed herself to. Walking back to her cottage, Amara realized she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. She was now harboring an enemy soldier. If discovered, nothing could save her. Not her orphan status. Not her poverty. Not her youth. The northern soldiers would execute her without hesitation, but somehow knowing that didn't make her regret her choice. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like she was doing something that mattered, something that was right, even if the whole world said it was wrong. She was no longer just surviving. She was choosing to be human in a world that had forgotten what that meant. Gray was waiting for her at the cottage door. The old dog looked at her with his wise eyes, and she could swear he understood. She scratched behind his ears and whispered, "We have to be very careful now, old friend. Very careful indeed." The next 3 days were the most terrifying of Amara's life. Every moment felt like walking on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step would mean falling to her death. But she couldn't stop herself. She had made a promise, even if it was unspoken. She waited until after midnight on the first night, when the village was dark and quiet. She gathered what little she had: a piece of bread she had been saving, some dried herbs her mother had taught her about, and clean cloth torn from an old dress. She filled a clay jar with water and tucked everything into a worn basket. Gray wanted to follow her, but she made him stay. His loyalty was strong, but she couldn't risk his barking giving her away. The walk to the barn felt like it took forever. Every shadow looked like a soldier. Every sound made her heart jump. She moved as quietly as possible, keeping to the darkest paths. The warrior, whose name she learned was Kale, was worse than before. His fever had risen and he was barely conscious. The infection in his shoulder was spreading, turning the skin around the wound red and hot. Amara knew that if she didn't help him properly, he would die within days. She cleaned the wound as best as she could, though it made him cry out in pain. She covered his mouth with her hand, terrified someone would hear. The herbs she packed into the wound were supposed to fight infection. At least that's what her mother had taught her. She could only hope it would be enough. Kale drifted in and out of consciousness that first night. Sometimes he would speak in his own language, words she couldn't understand. Sometimes he would look at her with confused eyes, as if wondering whether she was real or just a fever dream. She gave him water whenever he could drink and left the bread where he could reach it if he woke up hungry. The second night was a little better. His fever had broken slightly and he was more aware. This time, when she came to change his bandages, he was awake and watching the door. He tensed when he saw her, then relaxed when he recognized her face. They didn't speak much. She didn't know his language well and he didn't know hers, but they communicated through gestures and expressions. He pointed to himself and said his name clearly, Kyle. She pointed to herself and said, Amara. It was a small moment, but somehow it made everything more real. He wasn't just the enemy anymore. He was Kale, a person with a name, with a life, with people somewhere who probably missed him. On the third night, Kale was strong enough to sit up properly. The wound was still bad, but the infection seemed to be fighting back against the herbs. He could drink water on his own now, and had eaten all the bread she brought. When Amara arrived that night, he was looking at her with different eyes. Not confusion anymore, but questions. He spoke slowly in broken versions of her language, mixing in his own words. Why was she helping him? Didn't she know what would happen if she was caught? Didn't she understand that his people and her people were enemies? He seemed almost angry about it, as if her kindness offended his understanding of how the world worked. Amara sat down on an old crate across from him. For a long moment, she didn't answer. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? Finally, she spoke quietly, hoping he would understand at least some of her words. She told him about her parents, about how they died and how the village forgot about her, about how she knew what it felt like to be alone and helpless, with no one caring whether you lived or died. She told him that she didn't care about kingdoms or clans or wars that old men started. She only saw a person who needed help, and she couldn't walk away from that. Kale listened, and something changed in his expression. The hardness in his eyes softened. He looked down at his bound hands, then back at her. He said something in his language that sounded like a prayer or a blessing. Then he said in her language words that were clearly difficult for him. You have a brave heart. Too brave for this cruel world. That's when Amara made her final decision. She couldn't keep him tied up in this barn forever. The northern soldiers might come back any day. Other villagers might discover him. And even if they didn't, what kind of life was this? Bound and hidden, depending on a poor orphan girl for survival? He would heal better if he could move, if he could get back to his own people, to proper medicine and care. She pulled out the kitchen knife she had brought, hidden under the food in her basket. Kale's eyes widened. For a second, she saw fear flash across his face. Did he think she was going to kill him after all? But then she moved behind him and started cutting through the thick ropes that bound his wrists. The ropes were tough, meant to hold a strong warrior. It took several minutes of sawing before they finally gave way. His hands came free and he brought them forward slowly, wincing at the pain of moving muscles that had been locked in position for days. Then she cut the ropes around his ankles. Cale stared at her in complete disbelief. He rubbed his wrists where the ropes had cut into the skin. He tried to stand but stumbled. His legs weren't ready to hold his weight yet. Amara steadied him, letting him lean on her shoulder despite the fact that he was much bigger and heavier than her. She had brought her father's old cloak, the one piece of his clothing she had kept. It was worn and patched, but it was warm and it would hide Cale's armor. She helped him put it on. Then she led him to the barn door and pointed toward the mountains to the south. That way, she gestured, "You're home. Go now while it's dark. Follow the stream to the mountain pass. Stay off the roads." Kyle looked at her for a long moment. There were tears in his eyes, which surprised her. This hardened warrior, this enemy soldier, was crying. He reached out and gently placed his hand on her head, the way her father used to do. He said something in his language that she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. It was a blessing, a promise, a debt acknowledged. Then he said in her language words he had clearly been practicing in his head. "I will not forget this. I will not forget you. What you have done, it matters. One day I will repay this debt. On my honor, I will repay it." Amara shook her head. She didn't want payment. She didn't want anything except for him to be safe to go home to live. But he repeated it firmly. "I will repay this debt." And then he was gone, limping into the darkness, moving toward the southern mountains and freedom. Amara watched until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went back into the barn and gathered all evidence that he had been there. She buried the cut ropes and the bloody bandages in the forest. She scattered dirt over the spots where he had lain. Walking home as the first light of dawn began to show, Amara felt strange. Not regret exactly, but a deep awareness of what she had done. She had committed treason by any definition. She had freed an enemy warrior who might one day fight against her own people. She had risked everything, including her life. But she also felt something else. Something she hadn't felt since her parents died. She felt like herself again. Like a real person, not just a ghost trying to survive. She had chosen compassion over fear, mercy over hate. Whatever happened next, that choice was hers and she wouldn't take it back. Gray was waiting anxiously at the door when she got home. She hugged the old dog and whispered, "It's done. He's free. Now we just have to hope nobody ever finds out." But deep in her heart, she knew that secrets this big rarely stayed buried forever. The morning after Cale disappeared into the mountains, Amara woke up expecting soldiers to break down her door. She lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening for the sound of boots marching toward her cottage. But there was only silence, broken occasionally by Gray's soft breathing and the birds singing outside. She forced herself to get up and go about her normal routine. Act normal, she told herself. Be invisible like always. Pretend nothing has changed. But everything felt different now. Every sound made her jump. Every person who looked in her direction made her heart race. She felt like guilt was written across her face in letters everyone could read. At the village market, she sold her eggs like she did every week. The baker's wife bought 3 and gave her a slightly stale roll as change. A farmer nodded at her as he passed. The blacksmith's son kicked dirt in her direction and laughed like he always did. Everything was normal. Nobody suspected anything. Nobody knew. But the northern soldiers were different. They were agitated, angry, moving through the village with harder expressions than usual. Amara overheard pieces of conversations. A prisoner had escaped. A valuable prisoner. The commander was furious. They were searching the forest, checking every building, questioning anyone who might have seen something. Amara kept her head down and her mouth shut. When a soldier walked past her, she focused on arranging her eggs, making herself small and unnoticeable. Just another poor village girl. Nothing to see here. Nothing interesting about her at all. Days passed slowly, each one feeling like a week. Amara couldn't eat properly. Her stomach was tied in knots. At night she barely slept, startling awake at every small noise. Gray sensed her anxiety and stayed close to her, his presence a small comfort in the storm of her fears. On the 4th day, 2 soldiers came to her cottage. Amara's heart nearly stopped when she saw them approaching. This is it, she thought. They know, someone saw me. I'm going to die. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to hide them behind her back, but the soldiers just asked routine questions. Had she seen anyone unusual in the area? Any strangers? Anyone acting suspicious? She shook her head, kept her voice steady, and answered no to everything. They looked around her small cottage, saw nothing but poverty and loneliness, and left. They didn't even seem to consider that an orphan girl could be capable of freeing a trained warrior. That's when Amara realized something important. Her invisibility was protecting her. All these years of being overlooked and forgotten were actually working in her favor now. Nobody thought she mattered enough to be suspicious of. She was too unimportant, too weak, too insignificant to be involved in something this serious. A week passed, then 8 days, 9, 10. The soldiers gradually stopped their intense searching. They concluded that the prisoner must have had help from other Southern Clan warriors, that he couldn't have escaped and survived on his own. They never even considered the truth. The village began to relax again, settling back into its nervous routine. The escaped prisoner became old news, replaced by new worries about food supplies and rumors of more fighting in the eastern territories. Life moved on as it always does. Amara started to breathe a little easier. Maybe she had actually gotten away with it. Maybe her secret was safe. She went back to her garden, her chickens, her daily struggle to survive. But something had changed inside her. She wasn't quite as invisible to herself anymore. She knew what she was capable of now. She knew she could be brave when it mattered. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Had she done the right thing? Kale was an enemy soldier. What if he went back to his people and fought against her village? What if people died because she had shown him mercy? These thoughts haunted her in the quiet moments. But then she would remember his face when she cut the ropes, the tears in his eyes, the way he had blessed her. Whatever else he was also a person who had suffered and been shown unexpected kindness. She had to believe that meant something. She had to believe that mercy was never truly wasted, even in a cruel world. Gray had started acting strange around the 10th day. The old dog would sit by the road that led from the southern mountains and stare into the distance. His ears would perk up at sounds Amara couldn't hear. Sometimes he would whine softly as if he sensed something coming. Amara tried to ignore it. Gray was getting old. Maybe his senses were playing tricks on him. Maybe he was just being a weird dog. But deep down, a new kind of anxiety was building. Not the fear of being caught anymore, but something else. Something she couldn't quite name. On the 11th day, she was in her garden pulling up the last of the autumn vegetables. The soil was cold and her hands were dirty. It was a normal morning. The sun was shining weakly through thin clouds. A few villagers were visible in the distance, going about their business. Everything was peaceful. That's when Gray started barking. Not his usual bark, but something different. Urgent, alarmed. Amara looked up and saw him standing rigid, staring down the southern road. She followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. There was dust rising in the distance. A lot of dust. The kind of dust that only comes from many horses moving fast. Her first thought was that it was a Southern clan raid. Her second thought was that she was about to watch her village be destroyed. Her third thought, barely formed, was a question. Could this have something to do with Kale? She stood up slowly, her dirty hands hanging at her sides, vegetables forgotten. Other villagers had noticed the dust cloud now. People were emerging from their homes, shading their eyes, trying to see what was coming. The northern soldiers were scrambling to their posts, shouting orders. Preparing for an attack they knew they couldn't stop. The dust cloud grew larger, closer. Amara could hear it now. The thunder of many hooves pounding the earth. Her heart was beating so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Whatever was coming, it was big. It was powerful. And it was coming straight for them. She thought about running. Hiding in her cottage. Grabbing Gray and fleeing into the forest. But her feet wouldn't move. She stood frozen in her garden, covered in dirt, watching as her world was about to change forever. The thunder grew louder. The dust cloud became a visible mass of riders, and Amara knew with absolute certainty that her 11 days of peace were over. The consequences of her choice were arriving, and there was nowhere left to hide. Part of her was terrified. But another part, a small brave part that had been born the night she freed a dying warrior, was ready to face whatever came next. She had chosen mercy. She had chosen compassion. Now she would face the results of that choice, whatever they might be. The riders were close enough now that she could see their banners flying. The wolf symbol of the southern clans, 300 warriors at least, maybe more. An army approaching a village that had barely 30 defenders. This was either going to be a massacre or something else entirely. Amara took a deep breath and waited. Gray pressed against her leg, no longer barking, just standing guard beside her. Together they watched as the impossible approached, as the dust cloud resolved into individual riders, as the moment of truth arrived on thundering hooves and the wind of change. The sound was like a storm rolling across the earth. 300 horses moving as one created a rhythm that made the ground shake beneath Amara's feet. She could feel it in her bones, in her teeth, in the rapid beating of her heart. Gray pressed closer to her leg, whining softly. Even the brave old dog knew that what was coming was beyond anything they had ever faced. The villagers were panicking now. Women were screaming for their children. Men were running in confused circles, unsure whether to grab weapons or flee. The northern soldiers, those 30 men who had controlled the village with such confidence, suddenly looked very small and very afraid. Their commander was shouting orders, but his voice cracked with the knowledge that they were hopelessly outnumbered. Amara stood in her garden, dirty and small, watching the army approach. She had always known that her choice might have consequences. But this? She had never imagined anything like this. 300 warriors from the southern clans riding in perfect formation, their armor catching the sunlight, their weapons ready. This was the kind of force that destroyed villages and changed the course of wars. As they grew closer, she could see individual faces now. Hardmen with scars and weathered skin, warriors who had seen battle and death. Their horses were massive, bred for war, trained for violence. The dust they raised choked the air and turned the sky brown. The thunder of their hooves drowned out every other sound. The northern soldiers tried to form a defensive line, but everyone could see it was pointless. What were 30 men against 300? It would be like trying to stop a flood with a wooden fence. Some of the younger soldiers were openly crying. Others just stood there, weapons shaking in their hands, waiting for the end. Amara thought about Kale. Had he told his people about her? Was this his revenge? Had she saved his life only to bring death to everyone she knew? The guilt hit her like a physical blow. If the village was destroyed because of what she did, could she live with that? Could she carry that weight? But there was something strange happening. The riders were slowing down. Instead of charging straight into the village with weapons raised, they were coming to a controlled halt. They surrounded the village in a perfect circle, but they weren't attacking. They just waited. 300 silent warriors on 300 stamping horses, creating a wall of flesh and metal that no one could escape. The village fell into a terrified silence. Even the children stopped crying, sensing that something important was happening. The northern commander stood frozen, sword in hand, not attacking because he knew it would be suicide, but not surrendering because that went against every instinct he had. Then the circle of warriors parted. A path opened through their ranks and a single rider came forward. He was different from the others. His armor was better, decorated with silver and marked with symbols of rank. He rode with the confidence of someone who had commanded men in countless battles. And as he came closer, Amara's heart stopped completely. It was Kale. But not the Kale she had known. Not the wounded, fever-sick man bound in a barn. This was Commander Kale of the Southern Wolf clan, healed and strong, dressed in the full glory of his position. The shoulder where his wound had been now bore gleaming armor. His face, which had been pale and sweating, now looked healthy and determined. He rode straight toward her cottage, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found her. Even from a distance, she could see the moment of recognition. He knew her. He had come for her. Amara felt like she might faint. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. This was it. This was the moment when everyone would know what she had done. Kyle dismounted smoothly and walked directly toward her. The entire village watched in stunned silence. Who was this girl that a Southern clan commander would single her out? The northern soldiers tensed, unsure what to do. Some of them probably recognized Kale as the prisoner who had escaped, but they couldn't understand why he was here, why he had brought an army to a village that held no strategic value. Amara wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the ground. She wanted to wake up and discover this was all a nightmare. But her feet wouldn't move. She just stood there, covered in garden dirt, with her old dog beside her and her worn dress flapping in the wind created by 300 horses. Kyle stopped a few feet away from her. For a moment, they just looked at each other. She saw many things in his eyes, Recognition, gratitude, determination, and something that looked almost like reverence. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, this proud warrior commander did something unthinkable. He knelt before her, not a small bow of respect, but a full kneel. One knee to the ground, his head lowered. A commander kneeling before an orphan girl. A Southern clan warrior showing submission to someone from an enemy village. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was happening right in front of 300 witnesses. The silence was so complete that Amara could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear Gray's breathing. She could hear the wind rustling through the dry grass. Every eye in the village was on them. Every person was trying to understand what they were seeing. Kyle spoke, and his voice carried across the silent village. He spoke in her language, not his own, so everyone would understand. His words were clear and strong, meant to be heard by all. You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. You risked everything for a stranger, for an enemy. You showed mercy when the world teaches only cruelty. You gave help when you had nothing to give. I am Commander Kale of the Southern Wolf Clan, and I have come to honor that debt. The northern soldiers' faces showed shock and confusion. The villagers whispered to each other in disbelief. Amara just stood there, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Kyle stood and turned to face the crowd. His voice rang out again, commanding and clear. Because of this girl's compassion, because she chose mercy over fear, I offer you all peace. This village will be under the protection of the Southern clans. We will not raid here. We will not harm anyone here. Any who threaten this place will answer to 300 warriors. He gestured, and some of his warriors began bringing forward wagons. Amara could see they were loaded with supplies. Sacks of grain, barrels of salted meat, bundles of cloth, tools, medicine. More wealth than the village had seen in years. And this girl, Kale continued, pointing at Amara, is under my personal protection. Any harm that comes to her, any threat, any insult, will be considered an attack on my clan itself. She has shown me that honor and mercy still exist in this world. I will ensure that she is honored and protected in return. The northern commander stood there, his sword still raised, completely lost. His job was to fight enemies and protect northern kingdom interests. But how do you fight 300 warriors? How do you refuse an offer of peace and supplies when your village is starving? How do you argue against protecting a girl who had somehow impossibly saved them all? Slowly he lowered his sword. It wasn't surrender exactly. It was acceptance of reality. Whatever authority the northern kingdom claimed over this village, it meant nothing in the face of 300 mounted warriors. And surprisingly, this wasn't an attack. It was an offer of peace. Strange, unprecedented peace, but peace nonetheless. Kale turned back to Amara. He smiled, and it was the same smile she had seen in the barn when he was just a suffering man grateful for water. You changed my life, he said quietly, just to her. Now let me change yours. You will never be forgotten or overlooked again. This I promise you. Amara tried to speak, but no words came out. She was shaking all over, overwhelmed by everything happening. The orphan girl who had been invisible for 2 years was suddenly the center of attention for an entire village and an army of 300 warriors. Gray barked once, as if to say he had known something was coming all along, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting light on the impossible scene below, Amara realized that her life would never be simple again. She had released a captive warrior quietly, expecting nothing in return, and he had brought an army to her door, not for revenge, but for gratitude. The world had turned upside down, and she was standing at the center of it all. For several heartbeats after Kale's declaration, nobody moved. The village seemed frozen in time, everyone trying to process what they had just witnessed. An enemy commander had knelt before one of their own. An orphan girl nobody cared about was suddenly the most important person in the village. The world had flipped upside down in the space of a few minutes. Then the whispers started, quiet at first, then growing louder. Is that really her? The orphan girl? She helped an enemy warrior? She's the reason they're here? How did she even meet him? When did this happen? Why didn't anyone know? The questions flew like startled birds, everyone suddenly seeing Amara with completely new eyes. Some of the villagers looked at her with awe, others with suspicion, a few with something that might have been fear. The baker's wife, who had given her stale bread just yesterday, now stood staring with her mouth open. The blacksmith's son, who used to kick dirt at her, had gone pale and quiet. Everything had changed. The northern soldiers were in a worse position. Their commander's face was red with anger and confusion. His authority had just been completely undermined. But what could he do? Start a fight with 300 warriors? Refuse an offer of peace and supplies his village desperately needed? Execute a girl under the protection of an army? Every option was impossible. Kyle seemed to understand the delicate situation. He addressed the northern commander directly, his tone respectful but firm. "We have no quarrel with you today, Commander. Your kingdom and my clans fight elsewhere, but this village, this place, is now neutral ground. My warriors will leave peacefully, but remember this. Harm comes to this girl, and we will consider it an act of war." It was a threat and a promise wrapped together. The northern commander knew he was beaten. He lowered his sword completely and gave a stiff nod. His face showed clearly that he hated this, hated being forced to accept terms from an enemy. But he was also practical enough to know when he had no choice. Kale turned his attention back to Amara. She was still standing in her garden, dirty and overwhelmed, unable to fully process what was happening. He gestured for her to come closer, but she couldn't make her feet move. Gray, sensing her fear, nudged her leg encouragingly. The old dog had more faith than she did. Seeing her hesitation, Kale walked to her instead. Up close, she could see how much he had changed since she freed him. The fever was gone from his eyes, the pallor from his skin, the weakness from his stance. He looked like what he truly was. A warrior in his prime, a leader of men, someone powerful and important. But when he looked at her, his expression softened. He spoke quietly just for her to hear. "I know you are frightened. I know this is overwhelming. But you must understand something. What you did for me was not small. It was everything. You gave me my life back when I thought it was over. You showed mercy that no one else in this village would have shown." Amara finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I just gave you water. I cleaned a wound. I cut some ropes. It wasn't anything special." Kyle shook his head firmly. "It was everything. Do you know what happens to captured warriors in this war? We are tortured for information, then executed, or left to die slowly in cages in forgotten barns. I was prepared for that fate. I had accepted it. And then you appeared like something from a dream, offering water and kindness." He gestured to the wagons his warriors had brought. "When I returned to my clan, I told them what happened. I told them about a girl who had nothing, who was barely surviving herself but still chose to help an enemy. Do you know what my people said? They said such mercy must be honored. They said debts of honor must be repaid. This is not charity, Amara, this is respect. This is us recognizing what you are, someone with a brave and generous heart in a world that tries to crush such things." Tears were running down Amara's face now. She hadn't cried when her parents died. She hadn't cried through 2 years of loneliness and hunger. But now, faced with kindness she never expected, the tears came and wouldn't stop. Kale called out to his warriors, and several of them began unloading the wagons. There were sacks of grain, enough to feed the village through winter. Barrels of preserved food, warm blankets and furs, tools for farming and repairs, medicine and healing herbs, things the village hadn't seen in years because of the war. But more than that, they brought materials specifically for Amara. Wood and nails for repairs to her cottage, thick cloth for new clothes and bedding, seeds for her garden, even a young milk goat, gentle and well-trained. Practical things that would make her life easier, chosen by people who understood what poverty really meant. The villagers watched all this with growing amazement. Some of them were crying too, overwhelmed by the sudden windfall. Others looked guilty, perhaps remembering how they had ignored Amara's suffering for years. The baker's wife approached hesitantly and touched Amara's arm, whispering an apology for all the times she had turned away. Kyle had one more surprise. He whistled sharply, and another warrior came forward leading a horse. But this wasn't a war horse. It was a gentle mare, brown with a white star on her forehead, the kind of horse meant for riding and companionship rather than battle. "This is yours," Kale said, gesturing to the horse. "Her name is Star. She is patient and kind, much like you. In my culture, a horse is freedom. You are free now, Amara. Free to go where you wish, to live as you choose. This village may be your home, but you are not trapped here by poverty anymore." Amara looked at the horse, then at all the supplies, then at the 300 warriors who had come here because of her. It was too much. It was overwhelming. She felt like she might collapse under the weight of it all. As if sensing this, Kale placed a steady hand on her shoulder. You do not have to decide anything today. Take time to understand what has happened. But know this, my clan considers you a friend now. If you ever need anything, send word. If you ever want to visit our lands, you will be welcomed with highest honors. You saved one life, and that life has brought you this. The northern commander, seeing that the situation was resolving peacefully, finally spoke up. His voice was stiff, but he was clearly trying to adapt to the new reality. The girl will be protected here as well. She is one of our villagers after all. We will see that she is safe and well treated. It was a statement forced by circumstance rather than genuine care, but it was still a statement. The commander knew that having this girl under his protection was now a strategic advantage. It gave his village a shield against southern clan attacks. Her well-being had become everyone's concern, not out of love, but out of practical necessity. Kale nodded, satisfied. Then we understand each other. He turned back to Amara one final time. I must leave soon. My warriors are needed elsewhere, but I will return in the spring to ensure all is well. Until then, remember, you are not alone anymore. You are not forgotten. What you did mattered, and it will continue to matter. He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, looking every bit the commander again. The other warriors began forming up, preparing to leave. The entire village watched as the army that had arrived like a storm began to depart just as dramatically. Before riding away, Kyle looked down at Amara one last time. In his eyes she saw genuine friendship, respect, and gratitude. Then he raised his hand in farewell, and the 300 riders began to move. The thunder of hooves returned, but this time it was the sound of departure rather than arrival. The dust rose again, obscuring them from view. And just like that, they were gone, leaving behind a village full of shocked people, piles of supplies, and one orphan girl whose life had been transformed in ways she was only beginning to understand. Amara stood there holding Star's reins, with Gray sitting faithfully beside her, surrounded by gifts she never asked for, honored by people she didn't know, and watched by villagers who would never see her the same way again. The invisible girl had become impossible to ignore, and nothing would ever be simple again. The dust had barely settled when the reality of what happened began to sink in for everyone. The villagers stood in small groups, talking in excited, nervous whispers. Some were already moving toward the supplies the southern warriors had left behind, touching the sacks of grain as if they might disappear, if not confirmed to be real. Amara felt like she was drowning in attention. People who hadn't spoken to her in months were suddenly approaching, offering smiles, asking if she was all right. The blacksmith, who had ignored her for 2 years, came forward and gruffly offered to repair her cottage roof for free. The miller's wife, who used to look through her as if she didn't exist, now wanted to know if she needed help carrying supplies home. It was overwhelming and confusing. Where had all this concern been when she was starving and alone? Why did it take 300 warriors and an enemy commander for them to see her as a person worth caring about? Part of her felt angry about that. But another part, the part that had been lonely for so long, couldn't help but feel a small warmth at finally being noticed. The northern commander approached her, his face carefully neutral. His soldiers stood behind him, still tense from the encounter. "Young lady," he said, the words clearly difficult for him, "I think we all owe you an apology. We failed to recognize your value to this community." "That will change now." Amara looked at him steadily. She might be young and poor, but she wasn't foolish. She understood exactly what was happening. They didn't care about her. They cared about keeping the peace with the southern clans. They cared about the protection her connection to Kale provided. But she also understood that it didn't really matter why they were being kind, as long as they were being kind. "Thank you, Commander," she said simply. "I appreciate that." Over the next few days, the transformation of Amara's life became even more apparent. The supplies from the southern clans were distributed fairly among the villagers, with the commander making sure Amara received the share that had been specifically designated for her. Men from the village came to repair her cottage without being asked. They patched the roof, fixed the walls, reinforced the door. Her tiny, crumbling home became solid and weatherproof for the first time in years. The women brought her cloth and helped her sew new clothes. Real clothes, not the patched and repatched rags she had been wearing. They taught her patterns they knew, shared thread and needles, talked to her like she was one of them. Some of it felt genuine, some of it felt forced, But Amara accepted it all with quiet grace. Star, the gentle mare Cale had given her, became her constant companion alongside Gray. The old dog and the young horse formed an unlikely friendship. Often seen together in the small paddock the villagers had helped build behind Amara's cottage. Having Star meant Amara could travel to the market in the next village, could carry more supplies, could go places that had been impossible before. The horse was freedom, just as Cale had said. But the greatest change was in how people treated her. The orphan girl who had been invisible for 2 years was now someone everyone wanted to know. Children who used to run from her now waved and smiled. Adults who had ignored her now asked her opinion on village matters. The baker's wife always gave her the freshest bread now, not the stale leftovers. It should have felt good. In many ways it did feel good, but it was also strange and sometimes uncomfortable. Amara couldn't forget that nothing about her had actually changed. She was the same person she had been before. The only difference was that now she had powerful protection and had proven herself valuable to the village's safety. One evening, about 2 weeks after Cale's visit, Amara sat outside her newly repaired cottage with Gray and Star nearby. The old woman who lived closest to her, someone who had barely acknowledged her existence before, came over with a bowl of stew. "You did a brave thing," the old woman said, settling down beside her. "A strange thing, but brave. Most people wouldn't have helped an enemy. Most people would have been too afraid." Amara accepted the stew gratefully. It was warm and filling, better than anything she had eaten in years. "I wasn't trying to be brave," she said honestly. "I just couldn't leave him there to die. It felt wrong." The old woman nodded slowly. "That's what makes it brave, child. You did what was right even when it was dangerous. Even when it could have cost you everything." She paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry we weren't kinder to you before. After your parents died, we should have done more. We all should have done more." It was the first truly genuine apology Amara had received. Not strategic, not forced, but real. She felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. "Thank you for saying that," she whispered. As winter approached, the supplies from the southern clans proved their worth. The village had enough food to last until spring. The medicine saved several people who might have died from winter illnesses. The tools allowed repairs that had been put off for years. And through it all, people remembered that this bounty had come because of Amara. The northern commander, practical man that he was, recognized the value of maintaining good relations with her. He made sure she was consulted on village decisions, not because he valued her opinion particularly, but because it looked good to treat her well. It was political theater, but it resulted in her having a voice where she had none before. Some of the younger people in the village started to see her as something of a hero. They would ask her to tell the story of how she found Cale, how she decided to help him, what it was like when he returned. Amara found herself becoming a storyteller, shaping the narrative of her own life for others to hear. But at night, alone in her cottage with Gray sleeping by the fire, Amara sometimes wondered about Cale. Where was he now? Was he fighting in another battle? Was he safe? Did he think about her the way she sometimes thought about him? Their brief interaction had changed both their lives so dramatically, yet they barely knew each other. She had saved his life without expecting anything in return, and he had transformed her entire existence in gratitude. It was a fairy tale, except it was real and more complicated than any fairy tale ever was, because with the gifts came expectations. With the protection came responsibility. With the attention came pressure to be something more than just a girl trying to survive. As the first snow began to fall, Amara stood in her doorway watching the white flakes drift down from the dark sky. Star nickered softly from her paddock. Gray stretched by the fire. The cottage was warm and solid around her. Her belly was full for the first time in years. She was safe, protected, noticed, and no longer alone. It was everything she could have hoped for. So why did part of her miss the simplicity of being invisible? Why did she sometimes long for the days when she was just an orphan girl with a garden and some chickens, bothering nobody, noticed by nobody, responsible to nobody? She closed the door against the cold and sat by the fire. Gray put his head in her lap and she stroked his soft fur. "You understand, don't you, old friend?" she whispered. "Everything changed, and I'm grateful for that. But nothing is as simple as it used to be." Gray just looked at her with wise, patient eyes. And Amara realized that simple wasn't always better. She was alive, not just surviving now. She had a future that held possibilities beyond just making it through another day. She had learned that mercy matters, that kindness can echo in unexpected ways, that one small act of compassion can change everything. The orphan girl who released a captive warrior had received an impossible gift in return. Not just supplies and protection in a horse, but something more valuable. Proof that goodness could be rewarded in a cruel world. Proof that doing the right thing sometimes led to the right outcome. Proof that she mattered. As the snow continued to fall and the fire crackled warmly, Amara allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt hope. And that, she realized, might be the greatest gift of all. Winter passed slowly but comfortably for the first time in Amara's life. Her cottage stayed warm with the new wood and repairs. She had enough food to eat every day, not just when she got lucky. Star and Gray kept her company, and the villagers continued to treat her with a respect that still felt strange but gradually became more natural. But the biggest change was inside herself. Amara no longer moved through the world trying to be invisible. She held her head higher. She spoke up when she had something to say. She had learned that her choices mattered, that her actions could have weight and consequence. That knowledge changed how she saw herself and everything around her. As spring approached, true to his word, Kale returned. This time he came with only a small escort of 20 warriors, making it clear this was a friendly visit rather than a show of force. The village received them peacefully, almost warmly. Amazing what a winter of plenty could do to change attitudes. Kale looked well. The wound on his shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar. He greeted the northern commander with respect, then came directly to find Amara. She was in her garden, planting the seeds the southern clans had provided, with Gray supervising and Star grazing nearby. "Your garden looks good," Kale said, approaching with a smile. "You look good too, healthy, happy, I hope?" Amara stood, brushing dirt from her hands, returning his smile. "I am, thanks to you." "Thanks to what you did," Kale shook his head. "Thanks to what you did first. I told you I would not forget, and I have not. My clan asks about you often. The girl who showed mercy, they call you. Some of our storytellers have already made songs about it." Amara laughed, embarrassed. "Songs about me? That's ridiculous, is it?" Kale's expression grew serious. "In a world at war, in times of hatred and violence, you chose compassion. You risked everything for someone you had every reason to hate. That is not ridiculous, Amara. That is extraordinary. That is worth singing about." They walked together through the village, talking easily like old friends despite having spent so little time together. Kyle told her about his life, about the southern clans, about the ongoing war. Amara told him about her winter, about the changes in the village, about learning to adjust to no longer being invisible. As they talked, something became clear to both of them. The debt Kale felt he owed had transformed into genuine friendship. They had saved each other in different ways. She had given him his life. He had given her a future. But more than that, they had reminded each other that goodness still existed in a broken world. Before Kale left, he made Amara an offer. "Come south with us, visit our lands, see how we live. You would be honored as a guest of highest standing. Many want to meet the girl who saved their commander." Amara was tempted. Part of her wanted to see more of the world, to have adventures beyond this small village. But another part knew that her place was here, at least for now. This was home. These people, despite their flaws and their previous neglect, were her people. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe someday. But right now I need to be here. There are things I want to do," Kyle understood. "What things?" Amara had been thinking about this all winter. "The village has other orphans. Other children with no parents struggling like I did. I want to help them. I want to use what you've given me to make sure no one else has to feel invisible and forgotten." Kale's smile was warm and proud. "That is exactly what I hoped you would do. You have a generous heart, Amara. Never lose that. The world needs more people like you." After Kale departed, Amara set her plan into motion. She used her new influence in the village to establish a small refuge for orphaned children. It wasn't much at first, just a few children sleeping in the rooms she added to her cottage. But it was warm and safe, and the children had enough to eat. The villagers, seeing what she was doing and perhaps feeling guilty about how they had treated her, supported the effort. The baker donated bread. The farmers shared vegetables. The women helped make clothes. Slowly, The refuge grew into something the whole village could be proud of. The northern commander, ever practical, saw the value in this too. Orphans who were cared for became productive adults who contributed to the community. It was good policy, even if it had started from compassion rather than calculation. Years passed. The war between the Northern Kingdom and Southern clans eventually ended, not because either side won, but because both sides grew tired of fighting. Peace treaties were signed, borders were established, and Amara's village, which had become known as neutral ground because of her, became a trading post where both sides could meet safely. Amara grew into a woman, respected and loved by her community. The children she helped as an orphan refuge became the foundation of something larger, a place where anyone in need could find assistance. Her cottage expanded into several buildings. Her garden grew into farmland that fed dozens. She never married, though she had offers. Her life was full enough with the work she had chosen, with the children she helped raise, with Gray's descendants and Star's foals, with the community she had helped build. She was content in a way that had seemed impossible when she was 15 and alone. Cale visited regularly over the years, always as a friend, sometimes as an advisor helping bridge the gap between North and South. Their friendship had become legendary in both territories. The warrior and the orphan girl who proved that enemies could become friends, that mercy could be repaid, that one small act of compassion could ripple outward and change everything. On the 10th anniversary of the day she freed Kyle from the barn, the village held a celebration in Amara's honor. Both northern and southern dignitaries attended. There were songs and stories, food and laughter, peace and hope. The woman they called the Bridge of Peace, the mercy bearer, stood before them all. Someone asked her to tell the story, the real story of what happened that day in the barn. Amara, now 25 and confident in ways her 15-year-old self could never have imagined, told the truth simply and clearly. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," she said. "I wasn't trying to change the world. I just saw someone suffering and I couldn't walk away. I did what felt right even though I was terrified. And I learned something important that day." She paused, looking around at all the faces watching her. Young and old, north and south, friend and former enemy. She saw the orphan children she had taken in, now thriving and healthy. She saw Cale standing in the back with a proud smile. She saw the village that had forgotten her but now would never forget her. "I learned that mercy is never wasted," she continued. "I learned that kindness matters even when it seems pointless. I learned that we all have power to change things even when we feel powerless. I was just an orphan girl with nothing. But I had a choice and I chose compassion. And that choice, that one small choice, changed everything." The crowd was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. Then someone began to clap. Others joined. Soon everyone was applauding, not just for her but for what she represented. Hope in dark times, goodness in a cruel world, the possibility that we can all make a difference, no matter who we are or how little we have. That night, after the celebration ended and everyone had gone home, Amara sat outside her cottage under the stars. Gray's great-grandson slept at her feet. Star's daughter stood in the paddock, peaceful in the moonlight. The buildings of the orphan refuge stood solid and safe, filled with children who would never have to feel forgotten. She thought about her parents, gone for so many years now. She hoped they would be proud of what she had become, of what she had built from the ruins of her grief. She thought about that frightened 15-year-old girl, standing in a barn with a knife in her hand, making a choice that would define her life. That girl could never have imagined all this, could never have dreamed that saving one life would lead to saving so many others, could never have believed that her story would be told and retold, sung in songs, used as an example of how we should treat each other. But that girl had been braver than she knew. She had chosen right over easy, compassion over safety, mercy over fear, and those choices had echoed outward in ways she was still discovering. Amara smiled up at the stars, at the vast universe that held so many stories of so many people trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. Her story was just one among countless others. But it was hers and it mattered. An orphan girl released a captive warrior quietly, expecting nothing in return. And she found not just 300 riders at her door, but a future filled with purpose, a community built on compassion, and proof that even the smallest among us can change the world. Sometimes mercy is repaid in gold and horses and protection. But the real gift, the true reward, is simpler and more profound. The knowledge that we can choose to be good, even when the world is not. The understanding that our choices matter, our kindness counts, our compassion creates ripples that touch lives we may never know. Amara had learned this lesson in a forgotten barn on a cold autumn morning, and she had spent the rest of her life teaching it to others. One orphan child, one act of kindness, one choice at a time. The girl who changed everything had done it not through power or wealth or armies, but through the simplest and most radical act of all, seeing a suffering person and choosing to help. And that, in the end, was the truest kind of magic there was.